scholar and academic. I'm a teacher and a trainer. But the way that I framed it, I want to say that this is a talk about reflection, but also I want to say that this is about how published papers in ELT, applied linguistics, can actually influence, inform, and inspire people in the field. And therefore, I just want to say, I want to kind of like PSA, access to those resources should be open, because when it comes to any topic like reflection in particular, because it's rather sophisticated and scholarly, actually, there's a lot of material about things like reflection that normal teachers can't access. And my institutional access has come and gone in many instances, and it's frustrating. So, PSA finished. The paper that inspired this talk is Akbari. He's a person in Iran. Out of Iran comes lots of great ELT and TESOL and applied linguistic scholarship. This is the name of the paper. And I read this paper, I think in about, I can't remember exactly, but it's probably 2016 or so. I do think that I probably read it on the subway in Boston, because there was about a 3-year span when I was back out of Thailand and back home doing my master's degree and working in ESOL programs, state-sponsored immigrant language learning programs in Boston at the same time. And I took the train back and forth across the river, living in Cambridge, working in Boston, studying in Boston as well, Boston University. And I printed out, I had institutional access, so I printed out every potentially fascinating paper I could from my university library online and read them on the train. And this was before I had a decent smartphone and before I was addicted to the screen. So you can imagine me reading this paper on the train, and I actually found the actual paper I was sitting on the train with today that I'm talking about. And you can see how dog-eared it is, and you can see how the evidence of, the impact and the excitement that occasionally comes for, those of us with a bit of a nerdy edge to us, but really just a passion for ELT and teaching. And this kind of paper I mentioned in the abstract, it blew my mind, and that sort of internet speak for whatever. But what does it mean? It means really pushed me forward in my thinking. I was sort of a developing trainer, or someone who was thinking about being a teacher of teachers, or at least a mentor to others. And this paper was about reflection. Well, it kind of broke down some of the somewhat more shallow and maybe very sort of, superficial treatment of reflection that I had in my head. This is the abstract, and I don't want to commit the venial, or maybe it's a cardinal sin of reading it out to you, and I don't know if your screen you're on allows you to actually read that. I'm just going to leave it there for about 20 seconds. So that's the baby in the bathwater. A critical look at reflection, and this is absolutely not the only critical take. And before 2007, after 2007, there's been lots of depth and in critical looks at reflection. But I think it pales in comparison to the amount of material for teachers at every level, more scholarly level, and especially in the popular sort of discourse of ELT, that isn't particularly critical in terms of how reflection is framed and how it's almost it's promoted, right? I think 9 times out of 10, you read anything about reflection, it's actually promotional material of some sort, you could say. So why this talk is about why my mind was blown, and I'll tell you some specific things about essentially the answer why. I can't really, better not to explain so much as show you what it led to me doing. And I'm going to basically take you through 6 quotes from the paper. And you can imagine this guy, if you imagine the GIF for, GIF, whatever it is, If you can imagine those little explosions, I've got 6 of them out of my head there. So first one. This is probably an obvious statement, but it really helped me clearly frame and clearly sort of get a grip on what reflection is in terms of its historical, the way it is practiced, and why it often felt like there was a lot of tension in reflective activities, talking about reflection, because it has this sort of dual nature of it seems really unacademic, almost anti-academic, but in fact, or at the same time, it's sort of extremely has qualities of academic content. Just the brief history that I could probably know much more of, and I've done lots of reading, but I'm not one to call myself an expert about this. But in a sort of broad outline, it's thought of as, and this is what Akbari talks about in his paper, that it's really a post-method consequence. So there wasn't a lot of emphasis on reflection when teachers were simply instituting, the various methods that we all learn about from Richards and Rogers and all those sort of old school 70s, 80s teaching situations. But then, and so the earliest times, there were experts building theories, and then methods were based on theories. And at that time, prescription was the dominant mode, both in terms of how we looked at language, but also how we looked at teaching. And then something changed, that so-called post-methods era. And Allwright kind of describes the new condition of an irreducible complexity, that actually things became maybe better and freer, but also more complex and in many ways potentially more difficult for teachers. And it kind of helped me look at reflection as almost like a heroic scramble to deal with the incredible amount of complexity, and to almost, even on a personal level, appreciate why I've always not just been able to stroll into my classes and say, another day, another dollar, go home and, with a TV dinner and enjoy Seinfeld. I had to think through things and kind of do and reflect a lot because I was toiling a lot. And Michael Green calls teachers in the post-method condition uncertain practitioners. I just like that phrasing. So what happened? So there's a sort of a decision a reaction was had to furnish teachers with models of reflective practices in order so that teachers could navigate the jungle of a post-method teaching expectation. And if you Google reflective models or reflective practice models, you see these things, lots of them. These are pretty academic to me. On a practical day-to-day basis, the way that I had to work with reflection as a sort of objectified, not the sort of personal, entirely idiosyncratic thought process of individual teachers, but actually something measurable, learnable, measurable, accessible. I became a CELTA trainer just around the time, shortly before I read the paper, I think, 2014, early. And yeah, this is the criteria for Cambridge CELTA course. We need to take into consideration the growth of reflective skills for all candidates. And essentially, how productive are they, from this reflective process? And we actually, CELTA course and most, comparable TEFL course providers and the trainers who are tasked with carrying, often sort of off the street novice types teachers, but it's a big mix. But even them, they need to be able to do a lot of sort of relatively sophisticated reflective processing of experiences in a month in order to pass courses and learn a whole lot ostensibly in just a month. So there are issues with this, though, and I think, it's been talked about. For example, Daniel Baines has done some cool stuff, really reconsidering or rethinking, in his case, what we're doing when we teach reflection from the get-go. And he concluded that we shouldn't necessarily force, or there are consequences to forcing reflection on courses like CELTA. So he stopped doing it on courses and saw how that might have worked better. Make trainees aware of different forms of reflection and give them more space. So reflection as as this sort of objectifiable academic product that can be in a skill set that's defined by these sort of traditional, almost like a psychological, model of learning from experience, that's quite clean and sort of teachable on a month. And they have these forms that they fill out and stuff like that. It's not as clean as we might think it is, and I think people have been sort of reconsidering that on courses. Sorry, I'm on an iPad, so I have to stop to look at the chat. That's a good question. I will put the link to I think a video of Dan Baines' actual talk in the Google Doc that you'll get, so you can follow up on that. But overall, reflection, I'm not here to say we shouldn't do lots of reflection on teacher training courses, not at all. Because it's true that teachers are going into a world where they're not going to have mentors, they're not going to have trainers watching their every single lesson and giving them all kinds of feedback. Of course not. So as Kumara Badivelu says, we're a new type of teacher, and in order to be that type of teacher who's context sensitive and really sort of a self-made, learner teacher, reflection is like, I think reasonably thought of as like the primary skill set to cope, not only to cope, but to actually thrive as a teacher. But as I'll talk about a little bit later, like, not necessarily for everyone everywhere. I think this is maybe, I have now, especially after doing CELTA with mostly native speaker Americans in Boston and around the States, Seattle, and places like that, who have a background, share a background, a sort of cultural and academic type of background that allows them a quick uptake of sort of the idea of reflective responsibilities. I don't think it's necessarily the same everywhere, and I've done teacher training in Korea, Thailand, and online with various nationalities, and I don't think it's a universally dealt with or accepted in the same way. So that was number one, is sort of like, what is reflection, where does it come from, and some of the basics. Akbari says this. This is number two. And the retrospectiveness of reflection is a big deal to me. But actually, for number two, I'm focused on this part of the book. And this is kind of mind-blowing to think of, okay, what about imagination and reflection? What about creativity in reflection? And I don't think that I had thought about it as an imaginatory task, maybe because those diagrams of kind of like follow these 5 steps around the cycle seem so concrete. But I asked, I started to sort of maybe investigate this and consider what is the effect of those sort of really clean forms, cycles, steps that are quite sophisticated, but in not particularly magical or interesting. I mean, literally the form, I think I put it in my slides, but I wanted to show you, you probably remember, the type of page that's basically a table with different sections. It's a black and white page that you might have filled out as a CELTA trainee with the prompts, and it's seems quite technical often. And I asked people a couple of years later for something. I asked teachers to tell me. I didn't say do forms kill your vibe, but this is the way that I recorded them for myself. The responses to a survey. Basically, does the way that you've reflected in your career and you have maybe your trainee teachers reflect, using sort of forms and sort of unimaginative traditional methods, do you think that it necessarily goes straight to the heart of the matter? I'm just going to flip through some of the responses, and you guys can think about these. By the way, I forgot to mention at the beginning of this talk that I would like to have at least 15 minutes at the end, and any bit of this talk that you want to discuss, we're going to put you in breakout rooms, and you could bring it up with colleagues who are here. So maybe you can relate. In general, the respondents to the survey agreed that there was something maybe lacking, something wanting in the way, and they were looking back, and I think most of these people were experienced teachers who had stuck it out and maybe gotten to different stages of their teaching career and their ability to sort of be cognizant of the survival skills of teaching, but then also more sophisticated and complex ways of reflecting and being self-aware in the classroom. So maybe looking back, maybe it's no wonder that they look like this, but I think it's somewhat of a confirmation of Akbari's claim that there's not a lot of space for sense of imagination and creativity, typically in the way that we're having teachers, in particular early stage teachers, maybe reflect or giving, although some teachers, are clear about we don't want to, give them a blank piece of paper and say, write a haiku or something. But, in fact, perhaps. There's a couple more. I like this idea of there should always be a choice for just writing, right? So if the prompts don't happen to spark, the optimal thought process, why would we require someone, if they want to turn the paper over and write that haiku on the other side of the page or whatever it happens to be, or just write something, or not write at all and say, I reserve my time for talking to you guys face to face about this. I want to write stuff down. Why are we always writing these things down? And there's one more, and I'm going to put it on this one because I've highlighted it. So this suggestion just gets back to what was sort of thought process that started when I read Akbari, and this sort of idea of just trying to, I can maybe help trainees do reflection more productively if I gave them, there's maybe space for more imaginative or idiosyncratic ways of doing it. In particular, I'm thinking of a CELTA course where if you've done something like that, you remember every minute you're sort of on fire to get things done. So that's a crucible of this sort of thing. But to give them a choice, it led to things like this. So I presented with some of my CELTA colleagues and other colleagues about this idea of what we were doing on our course, which was differentiated reflection. So we didn't actually, by the time that we presented this, Reflection 2.0, like Web 2.0, it's like more personal. Remember that decades ago, Web 2.0. Just this basic idea, and we didn't have time to actually sort of codify all these things because our center shut down while we were doing that. But we did present about the basic idea of like what types of people are taking our course. Basically, there were three. There were total novice newbies. There was experienced teachers who never did a course like that. And then there were career switchers. And so we had newbie, veteran, and career switchers. And we basically talked about how we helped those three types of trainee through the course in slightly different ways, and we actually prompted them to reflect in different ways. So for example, the newbie would need, I didn't include it here because it's like a whole nother talk, but like the newbie needs a certain sort of orientation to reflection itself, whereas the veteran probably doesn't, but they might have actually been spending years resisting calls to reflect. Imperfect calls to reflect in like badly designed, year-end self-reviews where they had to tick a bunch of boxes and they actually made them not so happy to do what we seemed to be calling reflection. Or they just had automaticized practices that were, they had to reflect on those in maybe a different way. And then career switchers could use maybe the types of reflection, because reflection isn't just for teaching, it was actually promoted for all types of professions. And so maybe they reflected as a boss of a company or something, or whatever they happened to do. We actually looked at what they did in the past, now they're becoming a teacher, and how the types of reflection that they would have used for their other work could actually be applied to teaching, to the classroom. So it was an interesting one. And then later down the road, 2018, that was 2017, it was 2018, I did a talk, I think Mike Griffin was there, and thinking about imagination and specifically creativity and reflection, and just thinking about different ways, a bunch of different ways to just make the process of doing reflection ourselves, but also, maybe even introducing reflective practices to teachers, newer teachers, in ways that focus creativity and stuff like that. So, for example, I was working with Korean teachers, and we had a very standard, boring form that they just wrote sentences into the form, and I came up with something that prompted them to sketch stuff out. I can on the Google Doc, the follow-up Google Doc, I'll put a link directly to this template. But things like, there's a snapshot on the left, you can see a place where it's like snapshots of the lesson. And it asks them to put like sort of scribbles and maybe quotes, or just things that are a little bit more fluid and a little bit more, they can represent their memories in a way that isn't simply, typing into a form, essentially. You can see that this paper looks slightly more interesting than what you might see. Another thing is, this is along the same lines, is asking people to look for, maybe they don't produce their own sort of figurative or metaphorical representation, but they find something. Okay, so what's a song or a piece of art or something that figurative, metaphorical lens through which to represent what you've done. And this isn't my idea, really. It's Scott Thornberry's idea, at least. He has this great paper called Lesson Art and Design, where he talks about metaphors for teaching, and working with a bunch of teachers and thinking through critical incidents and teaching experiences, all through these ideas of figurative, narrative, artistic, expressive arts to frame it. This is quite different, I think, than going through Kolb's, 5 steps or whatever. That is comparatively extremely, scholarly and academic. I often feel like, where's like the juice in those models? I don't typically feel that much. You have to get it all in yourself, I guess. But why not, put that put that into the pipes. So that was number 2, that kind of, where's the imagination? And the idea of, we could say a little bit more about the nature of retrospection, but basically I think a lot of reflection, if it's going to be at all dialogic, or you're going to share it, which is a very productive thing to do, I think sharing memories of teaching is a little bit like telling people about a dream. It's really boring to everyone else. So you're actually not bringing that much out if you're constantly looking back. In any event, here's number 3 out of 6. Okay, so the basic idea, right, that we've got personal development and we've got corporate development, we've got communal development, something political, cultural, economic. And there's a sense in which, the critique that Akbari opened my eyes to, and then I kind of found a whole lot of this, not only in ELT, but especially in mainstream education, is this idea that be wary of reflective, the emphasis on teachers' reflective responsibility if you step back and look at it through a different lens, it's be wary. Why? Well, actually, here's what I have. I don't know, you guys know this too, right? So actually yesterday I'm not a disciple of this guy, but he's entertaining. And he had a video popped up on my YouTube yesterday, and he's talking about Amazon, right? So Amazon famous for slave driving in their factories. And so Amazon thinks you're dumb. I've took what he said and I've applied it here. In a way, ELT thinks you're dumb, and reflection is in some ways, the reflective stuff can be used by ELT to keep us dumb in some ways. Okay, what do I mean? Okay, so Amazon factory with what's called Amazon. So he's showing us that Big Bad Amazon has come up with Amazon. This is their lame attempt to respond to the problem of basically killing their workers, driving them insane. So with Amazon, the founder of this explains, I wanted to provide a place that's quiet, that people could go and focus on, I can't read that under the thing, focus on an emotional well-being. Does it focus on their mental and emotional well-being? And I thought, in a way, that's the way that reflective practices are sometimes co-opted by what we know is a very extremely profitable industry that we're in. And this is more from that video, but if we take this critique of Amazon and the overall sort of recent, maybe not that recent, but basically very pronounced recently, is this idea of sort of workplace wellness. We all know that our working conditions are never that great, and there's lots of there's lots to say about this, but that I'm not actually prepared to talk about it at all, if I had even had the abilities to do so. But in a way, I'm just making the comparison to ELT, to think of reflection as a sort of solve that isn't necessarily certainly not emancipatory, and doesn't necessarily affect the outside conditions that, no matter how reflective and how virtuous and how committed we might be as a teacher, we must deal with, the workplace conditions. So the paper the Akbari paper that blew my mind references the most is from 4 years earlier. So Lynn Fendler at the University of Michigan wrote this paper called Teacher Reflection in a Hall of Mirrors. And so she's just calling out the way that reflection can be co-opted to make workers of all kinds. And it's a Foucaultian, I'm not smart enough to even say Foucault's name correctly. But I get it. I feel like I get it. I got it. I blew my mind. As I really think critically about these things. Because the reason being not to doubt or stop what I was doing, but it made me value it all the more, try to do it well. That means reflect for myself and also be responsible for, mentoring new teachers and forcing them to reflect on things like Celtic courses. I was really paying attention to what was I pulling the wool over their eyes? Was I preparing them for 5 years in ELT of thinking it's all my responsibility? I just have to reflect more, and then I can be a better teacher. Around the same time, I actually was working for a language school in Boston that was not paying for any planning hours at all, and me and 3 teachers, one of whom was a very well-trained lawyer who was just basically moonlighting as an ESL teacher at night. Essentially, we didn't take them to court, but we put together a case, and we settled out of court for all kinds of planning hours back pay. And that was a really solid, that opened my eyes to I need support and I need pay for planning in order to plan better lessons. I don't actually need to just stay up all night reflecting on how I could make an impossible situation work better. In a way, that's kind of what I was doing. Okay, number 4. It's really getting down and dirty. I don't believe in your reflective practice. This is a rough take. Basically, you're going into the confessional booth and trying to absolve your sins. I think I've had this sense of sort of seeking absolution for my mistakes in the classroom through what I've thought of as my, and I think it worked quite well, especially when I shared it on a blog or something, and it wasn't actually in a booth with my God, my teacher, self God. But I think this is my favorite take of this talk. I think maybe conversation is better than reflection. So if I were to design a planet where ELT was happening, I would probably replace the entire emphasis on reflection in ELT with conversation. Okay, so here's an example. I've been addicted to conversation about teaching since the very beginning. So I'm just taking myself as an example. I'm just one person. It's not true of everyone. But I was on a TEFL teachers forum from 2005, from the second to last day of my Celtic course, 2005. I joined this online forum because it was on a piece of paper that my trainer gave to me. I signed up for it, and then I have posted 20,000 times in the next 7 years until it shut down because, well, I'm not talking about why it shut down, but there's less Majestay laws in Thailand, so there's a king, and it's still very serious. I think there's problems. But it was a very dysfunctional forum as well because Thailand is full of semi-professional or even very unprofessional English teachers who come from abroad. The local teachers are much, much nicer on the whole. But here's a back and forth ahead. I was on this forum very gung-ho the whole time about talking to people about teaching, and some people were really interested in that, and some people thought it was a pretentious boo, and they would pile on and troll me constantly. And a friend of mine on the forum, a friendly person, was describing this as, you want to be a piñata, you've been pooped on. This forum is a place where people can whinge and whine. I love your flute and tights ensemble will only attract crops. So here's what I described. I said, on one level, I suppose the extremely positive role this forum played during my first few years of TEFL in Thailand kept me irrationally attached to the possibilities inherent, even if it's an anarchy of asininity. Okay, an anarchy of asininity. That is a good description. But I remain weirdly shackled to some notion that this forum somehow better connects me to teaching through the connections with other teachers, some kind of triangular reflection. So when I found this in the archive of that forum, I thought it was a little piece of evidence that even back then I was thinking that conversation was better than reflection, if reflection is going to be a solitary, type of activity as confessional in the Catholic Church is typically. The other ways that, so I was doggedly committed to collegial conversation. The other way that I think reflection can be sort of set free from this idea of like the isolating confessional is rather than literally just sharing your reflection. So here's a blog that you guys might know, by a guy you might know who's in the room somewhere. You just love to see it. This is this is a prolific, this is incredibly prolific. I mean, really, I was going through it. I mean, this is from 2013, a post, one of many. And so here's a post about how this fellow has all these ideas going through years. He's reflecting on like 10 years of working with Korean students, and working with like the issue of like having an English name or this or that. And at the bottom of this post, there's a certain sense of like confessional sort of sharing, but it's not isolated, and it's not isolating because if you click the comments, you see 26 people, or at least 26 comments, discussing what he's just reflected on. And if you look at ELT blogs, especially in the sort of maybe glory days of ELT blogs, maybe it's not so busy anymore, certain ones still are. There's all this dialogic reflection, which is what, some of the reflection gurus say is a better type of reflection, is a dialogic reflection. And I totally agree. And that's why I've been a blogger and a blog reader. I haven't commented on Mike's blog nearly enough. So that's number 4, is that avoiding, what blew my mind was the idea of this is like a Christian confessional. And then what is sort of like what is the freedom from that sort of limiting approach? So here's 5. Affect, emotions. Again, going back to all those academic models, there's no place really for affect in those models. It's very cognitive, it's super psychological. And I think, I don't know, I just feel like I always had this intuition that because knowing myself as a sensitive person, and I bring that into this job particularly, I was always quite emotional when I reflected on lessons from CELTA onwards. And I guess there's this slide just represents the idea that we study and think about affect in learners all the time, and there's a whole plethora of issues and tools that we can think through and things, but there's not much for teachers. What does a teacher's emotions have to do with anything? Do your job. And what I've done, especially since, I think this might have been just before I read the paper. I don't know if this is a specific, ELT chat used to be, a very active place to discuss things on Twitter for teachers. This was one, occasionally I would suggest a topic for ELT chat, right? They would have 3 topics suggested by various people, and then people would vote on them, and then people would talk about that. So mine tended to be about affect. This is why I want affect to be part of my practice as a teacher trainer, teacher educator mentor, is because it's important to me, and I think it's important to a lot of teachers. So for example, what do we do when we've got that sinking feeling, really a black feeling of the black cloud hanging above our heads? Do we just reflect using Kolb's 4 stages, really? Of course we can't. It doesn't do the job. So what do we actually do? What do teachers actually do? Not academics, but what do teachers actually do when they get that truly sinking feeling, probably want to quit? And Maria had a talk in this room recently about this, and she knows good answers to that. Another thing about affect, which in the worst case leads to total burnout, that one of the last conventions I guess I went to, TESOL conventions, was in Chiang Mai. And okay, Rob, nice to see you. Sorry, we're up against it. I just thought it was ironic that in this entire conference, the one full house talk where it was just packed to the gills was this talk about teacher burnout. Like everyone wanted to come to this thing. Of course. Sad, but true. And then finally, the last thing that blew my mind So it just helped me to think about, what if I didn't spend, what if we did self-evaluation and reflection a little more efficiently, or a little bit more organically, or maybe not forced it so much into the time frame of the CELTA course. What space and what time would we free up for what other things, especially for early stage teachers, in place of reflection, if we're not going to go through the complex, sort of maybe trudge through a lot of reflection early on in a career, which I think there's maybe a rationale for not trudging through a lot of forced reflection. Things like teacher language awareness, or other things to be done. So basically, in terms of sort of what else I did after I kind of had a looser grip on the generic reflective practices as a teacher, educator, mentor, teacher trainer, I started thinking about teacher language awareness as the thing to reflect on, not so much what did I do right and wrong, but really when I was able to really focus on the language awareness that actually dictated the outcomes of the lesson, not the students learning the language, but the teacher being so aware of what they're teaching, the language itself, weighs perspectives on the grammar. For example, the meaning of this grammar. A lot of teachers that I was working with didn't know that grammar, didn't even really think of grammar as meaningful, as like a tense, has it like, why tell a story about last night in the present tense? Like, okay, I walk into this bar last night, I walk in, and then this girl, I look at her and she looks right at me. Okay, so you're teaching present simple tense, but as a narrative, with a narrative effect to make it sound really immediate in the present. I think there's more. I think that's really teachable, even to that sort of language awareness about especially if you're a native speaker and never learned, new teachable perspectives on your language. You just know there are so many tenses, and it's eye-opening stuff, and that might be more useful. I think it is. I do it more nowadays, or just focus on dialogue, reflective practice, especially local practices. What do Thai teachers do? What kind of reflection do Thai teachers do? And just having more personal connection to teachers that I work with. Okay, so the final quote is not from Akbari, it's from Allright. So for my sort of journey as a reflective teacher trainer, it was think globally, think sort of generically about reflection, act locally, bring the reflection to wherever I was doing it. But now I'm sort of thinking more locally and thinking about how specific people in specific locations, in specific types of schools can be thinking about using their cognitive skills, their affective profiles, whatever it is. How can I think through teaching with them? How can I support them in thinking about their own practices without necessarily the sort of the global reflective hegemony controlling my approach? Okay. Now it's actually time. The time allotted for this, we started late. My talk is over. I said that I wanted to have the time for a discussion, and I don't know if anyone can stick around to actually do that and extend this. Maybe you guys can check in with the audience, but let me share a Google Doc in the chat, which will follow up, and it actually is a place to have a discussion in the Google chat if you'd like to ask a question or discuss, but have to go right now.
Yeah, so I wonder what's the best way to do this, and I hope people can stick around. I'm really sorry that we kind of I messed up the Zoom and stuff earlier, so we kind of ended up starting late. I can definitely stick around for 15 minutes or so. So maybe if people can just drop a message in the chat if you're able to stick around, and then we can judge, do we need breakout rooms or shall we just stay in this room? And we've got the Google document over there. It's lots of good stuff, and you can also admire Matthew's handwriting in there, so that's great. Okay, so we got 1, 2, 3, 4. Matthew, I'm guessing, is 5. Carla, 6.
Maybe we don't need breakout rooms, and we can just have open discussion in the main room because it's not that many people. But
I think we can split up into 2. I think we have enough for 2. Yeah, because I think usually we just kind of let them run until everyone in the room is ready to head off. There's not really a formal end to the meeting, so I will set those up in a second. Because I do think we have enough people. I just want to say thank you again to Matthew for such very eye-opening and I guess it's definitely our time to go and reflect on some reflection or reconsider some reflection, and I'm definitely going to be coming back to some of these quotes and the Google document afterwards as well. Thank you so much. So what we'll do, I will set up 2 breakout rooms, and
the rooms are set up based on topics or no?
Do we want to set them up based on topics, Matthew, or because you've got the 6?
I think we can just do it. Split up people.
Okay, that's fine. And I will also, just in case we need it, I'll post the. Matthew put 6 questions in the Google documents for us to reflect on, so I'll put those in the chat now. If you need something for a prompt, but as Matthew says, if you feel like you're better off without the prompt, you can always just kind of go off and discuss anything. I don't think we'll be too. No one's going to be policing you on that. So that's.
I need a minute to write my haiku.
Okay, right, so I'm opening up the rooms now. You should get a little pop-up.